Well, hello everyone. This is Data Driven Chat. This is the first chat of the year, and today we have a very special guest, Samuel Salzer, who is a behavioral strategist, author, keynote speaker. He's also, you probably know him as an editor of Habit Weekly. And yeah, generally he does a lot of interesting things. Hi, Samuel. How are you today?
Hi, yeah, very happy to be here. First guest of the year. Feels like an honor.
So, did I misinterpret your title? Was that everything, or did I miss something?
So, yeah, I do quite a bit of different things right now.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time, I've just been behavioral strategist or behavioral consultant, but I'm also now founder of beha- some behavioral companies and some stuff like that. But yeah, we can stick to your introduction. I think it works. It works.
Okay, good. Uh, yeah, so we had several people on this podcast who had their own startups, and they were talking about how it's a very difficult journey to begin a company. So maybe we can talk about this today a little bit as well. But generally, if we talk about behavioral strategy, so what does behavioral strategists do? Uh, and can you tell us a little bit more about your personal journey? How did you become interested in behavioral strategy, and how did you start your journey in this area?
Yeah, sure. Good question, by the way. I think let's try to break it down. Well, because there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of labels in the industry and there's a lot of professional labels and it can be a little bit confusing. So, what I say that I do is to help organizations apply behavioral science research in the real world. A lot of it is taking what we know from research and putting it to practice in some ways. And this can relate to kind of in small parts trying to tweak the product or service experience and that kind of stuff. But especially, I work with these kind of bigger strategic decisions. So, for example, what features should we prioritize, or how should we divide our budget, or what type of research do we need to do, and to what degree, or maybe how do we, in the quickest and best way, go about implementing and scaling up our intervention. So it's a little bit higher level stuff that I work with these days than doing the actual research per se, or maybe doing those kind of like smaller tweaks here and there. But I do some of that too.
Mm-hmm, cool. So, and how did you become interested in this? Did you take a course? Did you read a book first? Like, what was what was the first thing that got you started in this area in behavioral strategy or behavioral science in general?
Yeah, so I was studying economics and finance at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. And I had a professor who started smuggling me books on behavioral economics and pretty much saying, like, this is something you should really be aware of. And I naturally found it very fascinating. And I think in general, the first thing was just giving me a little more nuance to understanding human decision making. That was kind of the first thing that really call it got me to fall down the rabbit hole. And then I was on somewhat of a call it like a two-stage journey with behavioral economics specifically, where initially it was this stage of enlightenment where I felt like, wow, this is so cool, this is amazing. I didn't know about all these things, biases everywhere, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But then I had a little bit of call it like a stage of disillusionment where I felt that I have this tool now, like a hammer. But when I looked on the behavioral landscape, I felt like a lot of the challenges were not maybe suited for this tool in particular. So obviously, especially nudging tries to usually target this kind of like one-time behaviors and doesn't really look into, for example, habits and those things. So I felt like there was not only nails but bolts and screws and whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and I need a little more in my toolbox. And so yeah, that's kind of the inception. And then since then, I've spent a long time in kind of navigating the field and finding my my niche, so to say.
Yeah, I have a few trick questions for you today with regard to practice. But before we go into this, so if I asked you to tell us what is your most what is your greatest achievement so far? What would you pick? Because I know you've done a lot of different things, and all of them are really cool. But if you had to give one example to our audience, who probably, I mean, the majority of people who listen to this podcast are either data scientists who want to know more about behavior or social scientists who want to know more about data. So so essentially they might not know Habit Weekly very well, but they are interested in behavior in general. So yeah, if you had to pick one thing that you are particularly proud of, what would that be?
Sure. So I think for me, it would be that I've had this goal for a long time of helping to create 1 million good habits in the world. That was kind of one of the early goals of my career. And it very much felt like a long shot for many years, and especially when I set that goal. And so I think the greatest moment was probably working with one of the leading digital health startups in Europe that had 40 plus million users, and kind of realizing that I suddenly was operating on that scale. That suddenly, the things I was working on was really having quite of a strong ripples in the world in different ways. And so I'm still working with smaller startups, but many of the projects that I work on today involve often millions of people. And kind of achieving that was, both humbling and very obviously exciting.
Mm-hmm. And so here comes my trick question. So when you mention practice, so how much of your work is actually explaining to people what behavioral science is? I mean, in companies, because like, I don't know about your experience. I'm actually quite curious about that. But my experience is that when you go to a company, a lot of times people think that this is some sort of magic wand, like just like data science. Is also seen that way. So it's just some sort of magic, and people. I think there's a lot of hype around the subject, right? And people feel that you will come and you will immediately fix everything with just one simple, nudge. So do you find any difficulties in kind of in communication with companies in that sense?
Yeah, I definitely think there's some form of misaligned expectations. One of
Mm-hmm.
the common metaphors I use is kind of building a house. So say that you were planning to build a house and then you wasn't really sure what to do. And so you went to your local builder and asked him or her, hey, can you show me your toolbox and can tell me the names of all of the tools you have? And the person is like, okay, here's this, screwdriver, here's a hammer, and so on. And afterwards, having learned the names, you would say, perfect, now I know how to build a house. And you go and do that. Obviously, that wouldn't be a good house. That would not really work very well. And a lot of people ask for call it like the tools. They ask for the names of like, hey, tell me the 500 biases that exist, or tell me the X amount of nudges that you think could be useful here. But a lot of what goes into good behavioral science is also the process. And part of that is understanding what behavior we're actually needing to change. There's a lot of behaviors that could be changed, which is the one, or which are the ones that are going to be the most important to target. Then understanding, okay, why are these behaviors happening or not happening at the moment? So understanding the kind of the problem. And then after that, like after having spent a lot of time defining the behavior and understanding the problem, then you can maybe go to trying to understand, okay, what could be a good solution? But I would say like 75% of the work often comes in those first two stages. And designing the solution can also take time as well. But it becomes quite easy to understand what the solution is if you've done a really good job in the first two stages as well. So I think that's definitely one thing. And then obviously another thing you might have experienced as well, I'm not sure. But depending on who you work with, some people are less inclined to wanting to experiment as well. And wanting to expect that you have the solution and you can just like take it and they know it will work. And that's tricky as well, because behavior is super context dependent. And, I've been working on projects that seem to be very similar. You say like digital health projects with governments. And let's say on the fifth project, even though I would have done, let's say, the same thing, suddenly I get completely different outcome. And that's kind of what's fun with this work, that you're not really sure always how things are going to pan out, but also makes it challenging because people expect that it's almost these kind of like copy paste solutions that you can just use in every context or in a scenario. And that's not really how it works. And you have to test, and then by that learning and iterating and kind of figuring out what is the best solution over time.
So how do you get practitioners to be interested in the why, not just in like what do I do, like how do I fix this? So how do you convince them that why is important?
Yeah, so I use a lot of metaphors. I use a lot of storytelling. I think when it comes to behavioral science as well, one of the ironies sometimes I notice is that when we try to teach behavioral science, we're not using behavioral science. And so you can see someone having, let's say, a presentation on behavioral science with really bad presentation slides that you can't read from, and a lot of jargon and a lot of, things that are hard to understand. And so if you're trying to apply behavioral science to teaching behavioral science, you know that people are very story driven. You have to often speak people's language. So you have to meet them where they are. You can't really just come in and throw around words like words like context dependent cues, or you have to really understand, okay, what is the language the person speaks, and how can I connect what I do to their kind of world, so to say.
So do companies often understand? So I just want to kind of go deeper into this. So do companies often understand that this is a behavioral, like something is a behavioral problem? Because they might look at I don't know, like about your experience again. My personal experience is that sometimes they treat something as as a technical problem rather than behavioral problem. Well, one good example of that is cybersecurity, for example. A lot of companies believe, we're just gonna buy this new tool, and we will basically completely separate our staff or customers from the technology, and all of a sudden everything will be okay. And then they essentially do not realize that a lot of problems that they have are rooted in behavior. Is that something that you encounter often, or people normally come to you as a behavioral strategist when they kind of realize that, okay, we have a problem with human behavior?
Yeah, and I think you mentioned one thing in terms of maybe misunderstanding the problem and thinking, let's say it's a system problem or technical or technological problem than a behavioral problem. But also, even when people think to talk about behavior, often they actually don't. And that's tricky as well. So people talk often that, let's say, I need to make my staff more engaged, for example. And then the question is like, what does that mean? Like, how do we know if someone is engaged? Like, what is the kind of engaged behavior, let's say? And so that's definitely a process. I think that comes a little bit more usually once people have, let's say, bought into, okay, we need your help. Then part of the work that I do is usually in the beginning kind of making sure that we speak the same language in the team. And it's almost have like a mini workshop of sort initially to try to help people understand of, okay, what does it mean when we're talking about changing behavior? So it's a little bit like you have to almost educate people in order to have them really, I guess, benefit and work easily together with what you do. I think, it's actually a lot of times not as intuitive as people think it is, some of these things.
Well, cool. I mean, I guess the coolest thing about being a behavioral strategist is, like you mentioned, you change behavior and you change lives in certain way. So, if someone wanted to become a behavioral strategist, where would they start? Where would you advise them to start? So, should they read something? Should they go study something? What should they do?
Well, providing strategic advice is tricky because it's perhaps not maybe something you start doing per se. So it often comes from building years of experience. And so is it better that I answer this as kind of like how to get started as an applied behavioral scientist, or more general, like if you have, because I think the answer would be somewhat that to start really understanding some of these more strategic questions, you can start obviously reading stuff, and it helps if you have some form of background in behavioral science and so on. But a lot of it comes from doing work in practice, getting kind of really into the trenches and trying to understand how things play out in different contexts. Who are the different stakeholders? How do they think and make decisions differently? So that when you're in a project, because a lot of the strategic things comes in the project where you have, somewhat misaligned incentives sometimes between stakeholders, and you have to kind of figure out how to lead that project and bring it home and understand how to kind of navigate all that stuff. And a lot of that comes from experience and being humble. I keep a decision journal. That's helped me a lot. So keeping decision journals and kind of understanding where you make mistakes in your decisions. I think when it comes to being a behavioral strategist per se, a lot of it comes into thinking in systems. So really being aware how things connect and how the interplay works within the organization, for example, but even beyond that. So it requires you to take a little bit of a step back, and not only, let's say, if you're a behavioral researcher, you might just study like specific behavior in a specific context and gather data there and kind of think about how theory could be applied in that setting. But if you work in a more strategic role, you would have to take a little more of a step back and also think about the different things that moves around there and how to kind of manage all these kind of moving parts.
I want to unpack this.
Not sure if I answered your question.
No, you. I mean, so I want to unpack it a little bit. As kind of people who work with data science at Turing, at least, me and my colleagues, we often work with domain experts, right? So very few of us are experts in something who then come to data science. So that's kind of, we have people like that in behavioral data science group, but generally I think we have normally very good knowledge about, say, data, right? And then we have domain expert, like, for example, yourself, who knows a lot about say health-related decision-making or something like this, and then we would work with you to try to understand something in data, right, when we look at large data sets. But like my understanding of what behavioral strategist does is, I think that you need to have very good domain expertise, right? So you need to have some expert knowledge. Yeah. Maybe it's narrow, maybe it's more general. It depends, I guess, on education and background. But I feel that's necessary. I don't know, like maybe you tell me, maybe that's not as necessary as I think. So like to me, I think that that's kind of required. Then the second thing is like you said, is probably kind of practical experience with just implementing projects, right? Because a lot of people, I think, who work in behavioral science, they are used to more kind of rather long time scales, right? So, and how to basically fit your project into 3 months or 6 months is already, I think, a cool skill to have. And then the third thing that you mentioned is kind of this long-term long-term experience with in kind of interdisciplinary work and working with people from different domains and backgrounds to kind of accumulate all this knowledge and develop it into some sort of advice, right? So as an academic, I kind of understand this problem very well, because very few companies realize that academics can do consultancy, right? And very often, like, you have to convince a few companies before the word starts to spread that, oh, these guys, like this academic group, actually can deliver solutions, because a lot of companies think that you're just delivering some sort of strategic advice. So like to me, it's these three components. Is it correct, or am I wrong here? Or you can can you basically just have, for example, a very good, say, project management skills and then develop the rest? Or do you need to actually go get a degree in economics or behavioral science, and then, in the process of kind of communicating with companies, communicating with other people from other fields, you develop the experience, and then you can actually deliver advice?
So I think you broke it down pretty well. I would say what's kind of as a caveat to the idea of building domain expertise is that, so when I think about behavioral strategy, I think about very much applied behavioral science.
Mm-hmm.
And so really putting research to practice. And what I see when I usually look at projects that involve applied behavioral science is that it's often this somewhat melting pot of, if you want to do it really well, it's usually kind of a melting pot of, call it connected but separated fields in some ways. We have in some ways a very messy world within behavioral science. We have people who call themselves behavioral economists, behavioral scientists, clinical psychologists, like a lot of these different roles where people are looking at changing behavior by wearing different hats and using different models and doing kind of different things. I would say that someone who's call it like a behavioral strategist or maybe a senior behavioral strategist is someone who can quite well navigate all of the different models as well that is thrown around, and understanding how they kind of combine, contrast, and how you can best really change behavior when changing behavior is a very complex thing to do. And so I think when you look at academia, it's much easier to have one theory that you study in a very either specific context in the laboratory setting or in a field setting. But then when you're designing, let's say, an app that's made to get more people to use public transport, there's usually a lot of different theories that you're playing around with within designing that app. And then you're also connecting that with maybe theories that you don't think about as maybe being per se behavioral science theories, but very much are in terms of they might be more like design principles. So, within design, there's a lot of principles for how, like if you put a button somewhere, like where to put it, what symbols to use. All of these kind of things are also in many ways behavioral science. And okay, you shouldn't maybe expect one person to know all of these things, right? But it's important that you're able to somewhat navigate and communicate within these kind of different things at the same time. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a little bit of a caveat. And that's a lot of what I do. What I do is coming in and figuring out, okay, what are the theories that would, behavioral science theories that would apply in this settings? And when I have a UX designer or UI designer that I work with, how can I kind of communicate and help them to understand, how to best, put their skills to practice in the best way that also aligns with the behavioral science components that we need to have in place. So a lot of those kind of things is what I think really is where the magic happens. And I really enjoy my work is really doing that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. So obviously a lot of people know Habit Weekly. Actually, I have a funny story to tell you. I just got an email, like literally, well, just before we started recording this. I just got an email from someone I haven't spoken to in 7 years, and they said, "Oh, I just listened to your interview to Samuel." So clearly they listen to you. They don't listen to a lot of stuff that I do. But, so yeah, so that's cool. I mean, the cool thing is like a lot of people know your work, who work in behavioral science know your work, and so the question I wanted to ask you is, why did you decide to? I mean, it's one thing to go and do kind of consultancy projects and apply behavioral science in practice, but it's quite another skill, I think, to try to basically start a network and start a project like Habit Weekly. So what motivated you to do that? Why did you decide to do that?
Yeah, so I guess the podcast listeners won't see this, but I have quite little hair on my head. And part of the reason for that was that for a good while, I felt like I was pulling hair out of my head for kind of looking for good content within behavioral science, and especially applied behavioral science. So there's been obviously some decent ways to find good research. But when I was looking for how that research was applied around the world, it was really hard to find that content. And so I was kind of quite frustrated for quite a while of that. I spend a lot of time every week finding these different pieces of content in these kind of adjacent parts on the web and so on. And I was just hoping that someone would put all of this in one post or one newsletter every week. That would just save me so much time and effort and heartache. And eventually I kind of gave up on that hope, and I just decided that I will create in the world what I wish existed. And that's how kind of Habit Weekly came about. And yeah.
So apart from doing the Habit Weekly, do you also keep some sort of database of these projects that you are talking about, or is it basically just, you know, you put it out there? So is there like some system to you know, and maybe some database at the background that you are that you have?
So you mean the system in which I collect things, or a database of the things I've collected?
Yeah. So in terms of this project, so like you said, I mean, you said, well, I couldn't find the content of practical application. The way, at least what I understood from what you just said is that you wanted to have some sort of like good examples of, or bad examples, I don't know, like equally, I guess, so they're equally interesting. So examples of implementations of behavioral science in the real world, right? So do you have some sort of repository at the back of Habit Weekly that where you can pull things from, or is it that you just want to have something that you read on a weekly basis as a news piece, and that was the aspiration?
Yes, I think it was a little bit of both. I would say, as in some ways, you know, challenges regarding this. I think initially the challenge was that I was just perhaps felt a little bit overwhelmed and overthinking what to include and what not to include and so on. But then I've now kind of become a little more comfortable with making the selections and curating these things. And so I think the biggest challenge right now, and that's been for kind of the last year or so, is just developing, I guess, systems for the things that I do and having a very good process and workflow for everything. And yeah, there is this massive database now within Airtable, which has all of the behavioral content that I've ever had in Habit Weekly, for example. And I'm trying to figure out how to best share that at some point. So that's definitely there. And I would love to share more of that and have that in some, as you know, when you have a lot of data, the problem is that, you know, how to easily package that data and share it with people. So I have that, and I'm hoping to share that soon as well.
Awesome. Yeah, that was the next question I wanted to ask, and you kind of partly answered that already. So I was going to ask you, what was the biggest challenge when you started, and what is the biggest challenge now for your work on Habit Weekly? Because I did read you had like this really cool post. I read it on LinkedIn because that's kind of the main platform that I read. And there you kind of described where you started and what you've got now, and yeah. But I was just wondering, like when you started, what was the main problem for the main challenge for you, and how that transformed through the years?
Yeah. So I think the first challenge, I kind of alluded to this, but it was that something that probably a lot of people can relate to is that when you create something, you want to get it perfect the first time. And so you overthink things, and you spend way too much time trying to figure out in your own, you know, whatever you call it, like your own little room or wherever you are. Yeah, exactly. Imagination is like, okay, this is going to be the perfect newsletter, let's say. But I quickly realized that that's a stupid way to do things. And a much better way is just, you know, creating something, putting it out there, and then slowly iterating and improving where you notice that improvements could be made and where you get feedback to improve. And so getting over that little bit of waste of time was the first big challenge. And a lot of the projects have since been really, really like really welcome feedback in any shape or form. And that's been really what I've looked at, combined with obviously the data I get from how people behave, what people click on, what people look at, and all those kind of things. And then slowly adjusting and packaging in a way where
I'm
makes
surprised
sense.
to be honest. Like you were the first person who told me like I'm really interested in content, right? So like I talked to several like really cool YouTubers. I mean, mostly YouTubers. I mean, they're not actually writing like a newsletter, but they've got very successful YouTube channels, and they're all interested in network. They all talk about, oh, I want to attract like-minded people who will read my stuff, like comment on it. But I guess it's probably the YouTube thing, right? You want kind of to have a community. So how important is the community to you, or is it just you want to have something interesting? So is it a content task for you? Or is it a community task for you? Because, I mean, I understand that it's a little bit of both, I guess. But, I mean, I'm quite surprised that you're saying, oh, I want to create perfect content.
Well, I guess it connects in some ways. I think in general, I'm very much influenced by, I'm not sure if I think we might have talked about it, I'm not sure, but effective altruism. So the idea is that, it's great to do good, but you want to do good in the best way possible. And I think it connects also to design thinking in some ways and other things within our work where you're really thinking about, okay, how can I add value and how can I understand the problem in a good way so I can add value in the best way. And so that definitely is there. Like I think the community is important, and I would feel that doing this newsletter wouldn't be very valuable if there wasn't a community that could benefit from it and that I was serving some form of bigger thing. So yeah, that's definitely there. And then I think I'm somewhat just like perfectionist, where I try to get things in a perfect way. And I would lie if I didn't say that a lot of the stuff starts with just what I find fascinating. And so I would lie if I say that I would only serve in the community and only serve what people want, because a lot of it starts with like, I find this an interesting thing to write about, or I find this really interesting thing to put together things on. For example, I've invited you to be part of this, behavioral design report of 2021, where I'm asking people questions of like, okay, what did you learn about behavior in 2020? And what can we do in 2021 with behavioral science and beyond to improve the world somehow? And that's just, mostly for me. That's just most for me. I find an excuse to get a lot of people that I want to hear their opinion to share that opinion with me. And then as a benefit, obviously I can package that in a nice way and share it to everyone else. And hopefully people will find it as intriguing and valuable as I do. So yeah, I guess there's a balance there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so sorry, I interrupted you about kind of like what is the most challenge. You already mentioned one current challenge, but I don't know whether you wanted to add something to that. To like one challenge that you said that you want to systematize somehow, like all the knowledge that you have accumulated, but maybe there is something else as well.
Yeah, so I think the current challenge is in some ways finding this balance of, there was actually a good word for it. I'm forgetting what the word was. It's kind of a new word for this kind of idea of something audience learning or something, I think it's called, where you create something. And then obviously to a point is really good to listen to your audience and kind of adapt things based on the audience. But you can also lose your voice and you can lose kind of your direction a little bit, because if you're just trying to understand what everyone else wants, all of a sudden becomes this kind of mash of kind of this average thing that maybe no one likes, because you kind of like just mixing things that random people like or different fractions. And so I think that's a little bit current challenge in terms of making sure Habit Weekly is, and the things I do is still in line with what I kind of started out it being, and not trying to adapt it too much to certain voices that maybe wanted to be too watered down, or wanted to have, more on a specific topic that maybe the majority doesn't like. And so I think that's a big challenge. And like when you have a big community, to make sure everyone is happy is going to be impossible. And so to navigate that is a challenge.
Mm-hmm. So here comes a $1 million question. Why habits of everything? That you could have picked a lot of things. Nudges, context, I don't know, something else. Why habits?
Sure. So this is a little bit cheesy, maybe, but it's true. For me, it was at the start when I was kind of falling down the rabbit hole of behavioral science. I started to really be cognizant of how the people in my life were approaching behavior change. And I started to become very, very aware that there were a lot of people in my life who wanted to do meaningful behavior changes, but were really struggling. And so they had intentions to, let's say, maybe lose weight, or let's say improve their diet, or reduce stress in their life, or, there's a lot of these different things that were happening. And I actually had some people in my life that was somewhat suffering. And I felt a little bit frustrated in that they went out to the world and asking for help. And often they got really terrible advice. They didn't really often get really useful advice for making meaningful changes in their lives. And a lot of it came down to habits. So understanding like how they could change their habits. And so that's how it started. It started with me being really motivated to understand how I can turn the intentions they have into actions and also good habits in the long run.
Mm-hmm. So what is habit? What is it? How would you define it? And how we can measure it?
Two very good questions. So the academic definition would be that habits are automatic behaviors driven by context-dependent cues and positive consequences. So if I unpack that a little bit, let's think about drinking coffee. I think a lot of people drink coffee as a habit in the morning, let's say. So the automatic aspect comes in where for it to be a habit, it needs to happen without much conscious thought. So pretty much the brain has learned to do instead of thinking. So it just does instead of thinking. It's automatic. So if it's a habit, if you kind of don't even think about making the coffee, pouring the coffee, but maybe while sipping it, you're thinking about, oh, this tastes pretty good. Then it's happened automatically. It's happened kind of without you giving much conscious thought. These context-dependent cues, what that means is that there needs to be something that triggers the behavior, either internally by, let's say, emotion or feeling, or externally through some form of stimuli. So same cue in a different context might lead to different behavior and vice versa. So it's very important that the cue that is in place, or the trigger, is context dependent. And so that needs to be stable. So just because let's say the cue in the morning is you walking into your kitchen and then seeing the coffee maker or brewer, whatever you have. And when you do that same behavior at 10 p.m. the same day, so later that day in the evening, that's going to react differently. Like it's all of a sudden almost bedtime. And so you have not learned to then put on a cup of coffee, because that will be probably a very bad time to drink coffee. And so even though that in some ways, many things are similar here, because of the context change in time, you're not going to trigger the same habit happening. And then lastly, what's very important is the positive consequence. So we're likely to repeat a behavior if it leaves us better off than before. So that it provides some form of positive consequence. And it doesn't need per se to be rewarding. I think a lot of people think that habit has to do with like rewards and adding rewards after behavior. But one of the strongest human drivers is removing discomfort. And so thinking about drinking coffee, a lot of it comes often down from like removing tiredness, removing those kind of things. It's usually what maybe is directly the cause of us drinking coffee. So obviously it has to do with good taste probably as well. In the beginning, people like the taste of it, but and obviously it makes us feel more energized. But especially what keeps it going as a habit is kind of like it removes this us going out of bed and feeling a little bit maybe groggy or tired, or being in the afternoon and feeling tired. That's usually the kind of the trigger that's kind of the problem that the behavior solves. And so that's kind of that's what makes a habit. So I've answered your first question. I don't know if I should continue with answering how to measure it.
Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because actually that's a really interesting question regarding measurement. So it's very tricky. And that's why we don't really know how much of our daily behaviors are habits. Some researchers claim it's 43% of our actions are habitual. Others claim up to 90% are habitual. And there's a couple of tricky things. So the common criteria when you kind of evaluate some form of prevalence or measure of a habit, you're looking at past behavior, but also in relating to frequency in the context. So for how long has this behavior happened? How frequent is it? And then there's these kind of like self-report habit indexes where people are like the research trying to understand, okay, how automatic is this? How much is this tied to their self-identity, for example, as well? And like combined, these kind of things can give us indicators of that some behaviors are likely to be more habitual than others. But for example, because that habits are automatic, they're done without much conscious thought, it can be tricky to really single out like what is a habit, what is not a habit, and so on.
Yeah, I mean,
and it becomes easier.
Sorry to interrupt you, but let me just give you an example. And that's where I'm kind of struggling with. I really do like the concept of habit, and I myself I'm using it in a few kind of projects that I do for, especially in practice, right? Consultancy projects. But there is often a problem with measurement. So here's an example. So there is a very interesting piece that Nick Chater, I think, wrote for The Conversation or some other popular outlet. I think it's The Conversation. I'm not quite sure. But basically, he wrote, I think it was about his recent book, Mind is Flat. And the example that he used in that piece was around, how Barack Obama has the same suits, basically. Well, when he was a president, rumor has it that he had exactly the same suit done in, I don't know, 20 or whatever, 30, there are 30 items of the same thing. And this was done simply because, you basically kind of open the closet, get a suit, put it on, and you're ready to go. And he presented, by he I mean Nick Chater. So Nick presents this in his piece. He presents this as a habit. Okay, so my argument would be that it's not a habit, it's decision avoidance. I don't want to make a decision about, I think the most, one of the most horrible thing for a public person is to spend time on, figuring out what to wear, because everybody's looking at you, and, you kind of wear one thing that is good for you, and especially for a guy, I think there is some sexism going on, I think, with public figures when it comes to sort of clothes. So for men, it's quite easy, I think. You just open the closet, put on some suit, and people probably would notice the difference. So to me, it's not a habit, it's just decision avoidance. I don't want to make a decision about it, so I just get something that looks exactly the same and put it on. Is it habitual? So how do, I guess what I'm interested in is how do you know it's a habit? So meaning that, I guess what you mean by habit is more kind of it's my preference, right? It's my preference to habitually do this thing rather than saying like, I just don't want to think about it. And, I just don't want to make a decision. And I don't want to have a preference here. So how do you pick like what it is? Or is it like really circumstantial and, like you said, context dependent, whether, when you make a judgment, okay, this is habit, this is not a habit?
So I would say that to break it down a little bit, so I would say it has less to do with whether it's a preference or not, or if it's like avoidance seeking behavior or not, because that's more about that, maybe what initiates the behavior, like what motivates the behavior to start happening. And then what's more interesting would be looking at Obama to just, so let's say we talk about Biden instead. And then we look at how Biden goes about his morning routine. So we will probably assume that he has a quite strict habitual morning routine. If he goes up to his closet, he opens the closet door, takes out the first thing on the left and puts it on without thinking about it. And then that's that. So that would be a very habitual behavior. We don't really know why he does that. We don't really know if it's to avoid decisions or whatever it is. But we can see that every day, in a very short amount of time, because that's one way of measuring habits as well, is like trying to see how much like thought is put into decision, for example. And so we can see that he doesn't take out two things and compare them and looks in the mirror and kind of, okay, should I have the pink one or purple one? But he just takes out every day, takes out the first thing that's on the left. Then that looks like a very, very habitual behavior. And so I guess technically you could have Obama engaging in a less habitual behavior if he would like go into closet, and then sometimes he would start looking in a drawer and choosing his socks, and sometimes he would start with a tie and like take out a tie, like whatever the process he goes about. Maybe he has a less habitual process, even though they go and end up with the same results, so to say. Cool. So does that enlighten kind of how to think about habits in this context?
So so the second question I have about that is about the relationship between habit and risk, because I think a lot of people think about habit as something that is really not risky, right? So in a way, like one of my friends is a cognitive psychologist, and he told me that, well, I'm not a cognitive psychologist, so I don't know whether that's true. I'm just saying, like, that's what I'm told. That our brain is basically programmed in a way, in such a way that we kind of know that something is not risky or something is relatively safe, and we just repeat it, right? So basically, that's why a lot of people often have jobs that they hate, and they do not have the strength to change and get a new career, so kind of making a step that is out of the usual routine is very difficult for people. So it's kind of risky, right? And that's why we don't do it. So is there really this dichotomy between habit and risk, or can habits be risky as well? Can you kind of habitually do risky things?
Super interesting question. I think you could. So when we look at something like risk, right? So one of the big theories is kind of this idea of exploration versus exploitation theory. I think that's Barbara Fredrickson. I might mix it up with someone else, but I think she's the one who's introduced that theory. And the idea is that throughout our lives, we have this varying degree of propensity of trying to explore new things and taking more risks versus exploiting the things we already discovered and have, so to say. And especially in our teenage years, we show really high risk, appetite, and very heavily explore in different ways. And then as soon as actually we reach around our mid-20s, that started to go down quite a lot. And we then engage in more kind of this exploiting behavior where we're sticking to what we know and so on. So I guess that's somewhat of like a propensity we have for the purpose of learning, and also fitting into society as we grow up. And so when we introduce habits into this, what I guess is I think your first point there is that we can interpret habits as being less risky just by the fact that we have repeated behavior over, a lot of cycles. We have survived those cycles. We've probably become better off through doing those cycles. So we can probably, in some like rule of thumb, assume that that's a less risky behavior. However, depends on how you define risk, right? Mm-hmm. So if you look at something like smoking behavior, you're actually engaging in perhaps like severely risky behavior, but because of the consequences being so far delayed, which is not really well suited to how our brains work in terms of we're very good at thinking about the short-term consequences, and that's how usually our habits form. They form by what's the direct consequence of the behavior, not the long-term consequence of behavior. And so we can end up doing a lot of risky behaviors. And another way as well is that habits are, per definition, automatic and without much conscious thought. And so talking about cybersecurity, we can engage in a lot of risky behavior. We can click on a lot of links. We can open a lot of files just because we have done that before. And we have done that before safely. And if you're head of a cybersecurity unit in a company, it doesn't really matter for you if an employee has safely opened a link 500 times if they open a really dangerous link 550 first time, Mm-hmm. So that's, I would say, where habits per se not being a guarantee for low risk.
Mm-hmm. So when habits are helpful and when are they harmful? What is the kind of the best and the worst thing about human habits in your opinion? Because you've been looking at human habits for quite a while.
So I would actually say the best aspect is that it gives us time and cognitive bandwidth to focus on the things that creates meaningful lives. So if you think about like habits as something like imagine some people actually, I think I'll come to that soon in terms of talking about the negative aspects, but this idea that it would be great if all of our behavior were habits or more of our behaviors were habitual. And to point, of course, but then we obviously don't want to go through our lives in this automatic habitual state, but not much conscious thought. It becomes a little bit, I don't know if you saw the movie Click, like the movie Adam Sandler way back. But the whole idea is that he has this remote where he can fast forward things and not, all of the decisions are taken automatically. And he fast forwards to advance in his career, but then he regrets all of those moments he could have spent with his family and seeing his kids grow up and that kind of stuff. And same thing is like habits are good to a point. They're really great if you can find ways to, spend less time, let's say choosing a suit in the morning, or make it a little bit easier for you to get to the gym and do your workouts and that kind of stuff. But they're really there to remove the cognitive load that can be spent on then having meaningful experiences at work or with your family or whatever it is. So less thinking about the meaning, like the more medial aspects of life, and more be able to dedicate your time to more meaningful things. Mm-hmm. That I would say is the best benefit of habits.
Mm-hmm. So and the yeah, the worst part.
Yeah. So I think actually there's a lot of bad aspects. Maybe it's somewhat weird for me to talk about the bad aspects of habits, given that I'm usually the one seeming
give us
to
just
kind of like
one example. Yeah.
But yeah, I would say that so one is that there's a huge overbelief, I think, in that habits is kind of this panacea to all of our problems. So that's a kind of almost like shooting yourself in the foot in hoping that everything can be turned into habit, where most things can't really be turned into habit. We can make things, if you look at it on a spectrum, we can make things become more habitual, but you can never have ended up going to the gym, working out for 15 minutes, and then going back home without conscious thoughts. Like that's never going to be a habit in itself. Mm-hmm. You can have some habits sprinkled in along the way, but that's not going to happen. And then obviously a big tricky thing with habits is they're kind of cruel, that often it can be easy to break good habits, but very hard to break bad habits.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of a cruel aspect of habits as well.
Yeah, I guess here is when I should ask you which bad habits do you have, but I'm not gonna do that. So I'm just gonna ask you something
Thanks for
else.
sparing me the public shame.
I was going to ask you something else, just generally about behavioral science. So we've talked quite a lot about behavioral science already, but so very often when I attend behavioral science, not behavioral data science, but behavioral science seminars now, conferences, a lot of people talk about that, behavioral science is not what it used to be, that essentially it's dead. Because, the argument is that we haven't had kind of major breakthroughs lately in behavioral science. What is your opinion about that? So do you agree with this or do you disagree with this?
That behavioral science is dead?
Yeah.
Well, I guess I hope not. No, I think what I find interesting is that we maybe sometimes think about behavioral science in the wrong way, where I think that the biggest thing that's obviously is happening is that we have a very big growth in the last 10 years in the application of applied behavioral science, or like behavioral science. So applied behavioral science has grown very quickly in the last decades, both in the private and public sector. And so that's obviously what I think a lot about. Obviously, you can think about the theory and think about if the theory is about, but I also think that we should be quite happy with having some pretty solid theories at this point, where before, call it like the very early pioneers were very much just smoking their pipes and kind of having some form of philosophy that they put into as a theory, where some of the theories, like, let's say, as just an example, Big Five, that was something that really came through more like as a combination of data science and behavioral science, of like really trying to understand how personality theory looks in practice, and what are the correlating variables and all those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have some of those things that are actually in place, and we should be quite happy with having more and more theories like that has been starting to evolve. Self-determination theory as well, a similar theory that's going around for a lot of work for a long time, and now it's quite reliable. And so I don't think evolution in theories per se is the big problem. I think the big problem has still been for a long time of how to think about applying that in practice. And so I think what I think could be maybe not be dead, but is dying, is this more like philosophical aspect of behavioral science, and that we're welcoming a more, your audience probably be happy to hear this, and you're honestly a big contributor to this, but more data-driven and analytical approach to thinking about behavioral science. So in that sense, I guess you could see that what behavioral science has been for a long time maybe is somewhat dead, but maybe more as a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, and that it is leading to something better, or I don't know, something different, right?
Yeah.
So that's
cool
how I think
analogy
about
there.
it.
Yeah, great. So, you worked a lot, like you said yourself at the beginning of the interview. You talked about kind of medical applications. So, and I wanted to ask you about the behavioral design for COVID and your thoughts on that. So, we saw a whole year of all kinds of weird and wonderful things. So, in your opinion, what were the kind of the biggest successes and the biggest failures? I mean, I'm gonna let you choose. You can only talk about, if you want, you can talk about positives, or you can talk about negatives. But in your opinion, was the behavioral design adequate, and what were the best and the worst examples of COVID-related behavioral design?
Sure. So I think this maybe is more of a lesson, but the first one is how much the messenger matters.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's been a failure in messengers through the COVID epidemic in many places around the world. I can only speak so I live in Sweden right now, and I'm obviously quite in touch with what's happening in the US and UK. And some of the leading messengers within the pandemic, let's say the leading politicians or the leading medical experts, has really failed the people in that they haven't kind of lived up to what they preached. There have been a lot of these scandals where you have a leading expert saying what people should do and then getting caught doing something different.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that is such a severe, like leads to a severe diminishing in trust and so on. And we also see, how the messenger matters a lot, where if you're going to get so many different people with different types of, call it like political ideologies as well, to agree on something, it's very hard when you have different messengers on each side telling people different things. Mm-hmm. Some people saying the mask is important, some people saying that it's not. And so people are going to listen to kind of the leaders within their social group. And so it's really important to align these messengers so that they have the kind of the same message. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a general, I think that's lesson has been reaffirmed in the last year, how important that is. And that just over the holidays in Sweden, where the prime minister who's been like the leading voice, who has been kind of leading by examples and having these kind of press conferences where he's encouraged the Swedish citizens to kind of be proud and support each other by not doing stupid things like shopping between the Christmas and New Year's where there's sales. And then he's caught doing that thing on camera. And it's like the most stupid thing to do. And so that's a little bit disappointing to see a lot of messengers doing stupid things. Second thing would be more of a random funny thing. I think we see a lot of stickers on the ground. Mm-hmm. And obviously they don't always work, but I'm actually surprised how well they work a lot of times. And just how like these small cues can actually be really helpful. Because we know that people are really bad for knowing like what is X amount of feet or 2 meters. Like it's hard to know that. And so stickers on the ground, I think, has had not a perfect record, but as a simple intervention, I think it's working pretty well. One of the more elaborate interventions that I think went pretty well was this camera that was sensing mask wearing and then gave instructions on bus stops. So knowing that public transport is very important for, transmissions, like getting people to wear masks there is going to be very important. So having these kind of interactive billboards of sorts that give people instructions for like kind of nudging them to put on the mask in the proper way, even over their nose. That was a very nice intervention. I give full credit to that. I think that was in Asia. I'm trying to remember exactly which country.
Yeah, there is a European prototype. I don't know. I my hunch was that that was in Netherlands, but I'm not sure. I actually saw the European version very recently, but it was an advert, so I'm not quite sure about the kind of the whereabouts of this. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say if I would add one or two more, one thing that was interesting was, you being someone based in the UK, it was interesting with the whole strategy in the UK, where initially there was quite a lot of involvement with some not behavioral strategists per se, but maybe behavioral economists or behavioral scientists, you could say, which talked about behavioral fatigue. And they got a lot of shit thrown at them because that delayed in some ways perhaps the lockdown being put into place in the UK. But it's really hard, actually. I would say in hindsight, in some ways they were probably right that, lockdowns lead to behavioral fatigue, sure. And probably a better lesson is just that knowing when the behavioral perspective is the most important and knowing when the epidemiologist's perspective is maybe even trumps that and saying that, well, okay, maybe this will lead to some behavioral fatigue, but yeah.
Yeah, I think we had even like a letter that I think many academics signed when that kind of this thing came out, because obviously, I mean, like to me, and I kind of talked a lot about it in great detail, but to me, I think obviously lockdown will affect you, but then to say that it will be fatigue specifically, I don't think we've done enough research, to say that. So yeah, I mean, there was quite a big scientific debate at the beginning of 2020 about that. Yeah, but I agree with you that definitely had a lot of kind of negative consequences, and it costed lives. But now apparently. It's not clear where this advice originated after we've we've basically identified this problem with many of my colleagues. I have to say many people signed the letter. So I mentioned already Nick Chater, so he was one of the initiators of this. But yeah, I mean it's quite amazing. But don't you feel? I mean, one of the things that I was very surprised about is there is so much expectation that was put into behavioral science, because in a way, this is a problem for epidemiologists, right, and people who work on vaccines, and so it's really a problem for medical science rather than for behavioral scientists, because whatever things we invent, in the pandemic, these things are temporary. They will not work in the long term. In the long term, what we need is a vaccine. I mean, now we have a hope that we've got one with these mutations and other things that are happening. I'm not sure how effective it is, but I mean, let's just assume that we do have it. But didn't you feel that it was a little bit like too much weight was put on, and too much expectation was put on behavioral science as this magic tool that behavioral scientists will now come and figure this whole thing out for us?
Well, wouldn't it be nice if we could, I think that's the thing as well, in terms of it was another opportunity for the field to maybe take a little bit of what do you call it, like a humbling sip of something. Because I think in some way, I think we could be better there. There's been some great initiative. I think, for example, I know a friend, Peter Slattery and BehaviorWorks Australia, I think have been trying to start accumulating more resources in this regard. And there's been, talking about Australia, I know as well, there was a kind of a unit in Victoria to help support the Victorian government with making policies based on kind of behavioral informed science and so on. And so I think maybe for the next pandemic, hopefully it's not going to happen in a very long time, but I think we still should be hoping or wanting to be able to support more. And I think we're just a very young field when it comes to applied behavioral science, and that was a proof of that we couldn't really be there to the degree that we probably could or maybe wanted to, because there's still so much that we don't know and that we can't really guide governments with making decisions on. So I think that's really where it's at.
Yeah, but I mean,
but I hope,
another thing that I think that you brought up. So that's another, I think, worrisome thing that came out is rigor, right? Because I feel that a lot, like you said, I mean, yes. So I think there is a complete mess with who delivers the message, and that there is no agreement, and then there are this constant U-turns on this. Wish you should do this, you should not do that. To me, I also think that governments should really explain risk to people rather than just tell them, oh, don't do this, don't do that. So because that's you need to understand the boundaries and consequences of your decisions. But also I think it brings up an important question about rigor in practice, right? So when we apply behavioral into some sort of behavioral science in practice, very often what I get, I mean, I actually talk to people who do an enormous number of behavioral projects in the UK. I'm not going to name the organization, but they basically told me that effectively they do not, they do not consider rigor to be an important thing, because effectively they simply need to deliver a project within the frame of like a month or 2 months or 3 months. And then in this trade-off, the rigor often fails to win against the time. So how do we, like, and that's kind of, I'm going to merge it with my next question. So I was going to ask you, what is the future? What is the development of behavioral strategy or behavioral science in practice, applied behavioral science in the next 5 years? And this question about rigor, do you think it's going to become more rigorous, like people will start to care more about what exactly is being done? And things like behavioral fatigue, right? Like, I mean, when you say that, it's one thing, but another thing is when politicians actually implement it, and due to this, people die. So that's a huge consequence.
Huge. Yeah, I would hope so. I think, are you familiar with the lemon problem? It's more of an economics thing.
Yeah, but I mean, maybe you please explain it for the audience. Yeah, I think that would be helpful.
So there's this idea where when there's information asymmetry, which pretty much is a fancy word for saying that there's two parties where one person knows something that the other person doesn't know, and vice versa. What can happen in a market is that you have, let's say in the secondhand car dealership market, there are some cars that are of the same model that's been maintained at different levels of quality. And so when they're resold, some of them are worth, let's say, $10,000. They're poorly kind of kept in quality. And then some of them are worth $20,000. They're very well maintained. And then when you have this seller meeting a buyer to do this transaction, it's really hard usually for maybe the seller to clearly signal what quality of car they have. Maybe outside of the car, they can show that they have, it looks good, it has a good set of paint, like it hasn't been scratched, some of those things. But some of the more intricate things, and that are more maybe costly to repair, like engine problems, can be very hard to know, and very hard to know how well it's been maintained on a daily basis, right? And so what happens then, which is kind of the tragedy here, is that you can have some of these shitty cars, what we call lemons, being sold for, let's say, $15,000, and the really good cars that are worth $20,000 being sold for the same price, because the buyers and the sellers can't effectively communicate and know. The buyer can know if it's a lemon or it's not. Mm-hmm. So it's not, even though if it looks like a good car, it's not willing to take the risk of buying a lemon. So it's not willing to pay $20,000. And I feel like we're facing the same problem in applied behavioral science, in that there's a lot of people saying that they do applied behavioral science. There's a lot of people with behavioral in their name, behavioral marketers, behavioral, I'm just saying a lot of titles, right? And from someone who's in an organization thinking, hey, I really need some help, perhaps from someone with behavioral knowledge, whether that's the PM of the UK, or if that's some form of startup founder who's looking to get advice from someone who knows about behavioral science. It's really hard to know if they hire someone who's a lemon, who's just tagged on behavioral into their professional tag, and very, very basically have no rigor, have no real clear way of actually applying this theory in a good way in practice. Because there's a really high degree of information asymmetry. And so what I hope for the coming years is that we're going to find better ways to signal quality behavioral science. And there's some initiatives. Both you have GABS, which is the Global Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists, and then you have ABSA, the Association of Applied Behavioral Scientists, or something like that. I'm not the best with acronyms, but I think that's the two names. And both of them are trying to, in different ways, align different actors, making sure that there's some form of quality in rigor and some form of stamp of approval of knowing that, okay, at least we know that if you're part of this one association of sort, then maybe you're more likely to be doing things in a more rigorous way.
Mm-hmm.
So I definitely hope that's a trend, and I'm seeing it coming about. So I'm going to do my best to support it, obviously. But it's tricky. It's tricky, that thing of where you have someone who doesn't know behavioral science. It's very hard for them to know if someone else knows it or not, and they're very easy to be tricked by someone who can just list a lot of cognitive biases, and they'll be like, oh, well, if this person knows 100 cognitive biases, maybe they're behavioral expert now. So yeah, it's a tricky problem, but I hope we will be better at solving it in the coming decade.
Yeah. Well, let's hope. Okay, so here comes basically a set of questions that I ask at the end, and everybody complains about these questions, but I don't know if you saw. But yeah, I guess I think you did because you commented on it, and yeah. So we basically do this kind of annual poster with book and film recommendations. So that normally comes handy at the end and at the beginning of the year. And essentially, yeah, the question, the first question is if I asked you to recommend one book and one film, what would your recommendations be? And these recommendations do not have to be in behavioral science necessarily. So it could be any book, any film that you like that you coming back to. But you can just pick one.
Okay, right. I'm a major cinephile and major bibliophile as well. Mm-hmm. So I'm a nerd when it comes to both of those things, and I read a lot. I watch a lot of movies, and I just finished my top 20 movies of 2020. Mm-hmm. So I can still share that with the audience in the link or something in the description.
Yeah. I will share that definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's hard for me to choose one. I think. Okay, so in the book category, I think Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me is a really good book for both people that are senior behavioral scientists and also people young and don't know any behavioral science. I guess the title gives it away a little bit, but it really helps us better understand, this idea of why people do what they do and kind of deal with cognitive dissonance in funny ways, and how that kind of logic plays in how we form our worldviews and how we kind of guide our self-reasoning of the things, why we do what we do, and so on. So that's a really good book, and by good researchers as well. If I could sneak in, maybe use for the listeners, some more less behavioral books, but if people are sick of reading intellectual books and just want two good books, one is Dark Matter. It's one of the best sci-fi thrillers, call it sci-fi thriller, like just this kind of book you read in one sitting. That's just a really good book. It's like, not highbrow, but just like good sci-fi. And then Poorly Drawn Lines, which is more of a comic book of sort, but it's really funny and a great gift as well. A little bit too late for the holidays, but still, that's a really good one. I've reread my Poorly Drawn Lines probably 10 times because it's such a funny little book. For best movie, I would say I'll take one from 2020. So Wolfwalkers, I would strongly recommend. So people talk about Soul because it's a Pixar movie. I think that was a good movie, but Wolfwalkers is so much better. Sorry for upsetting any Pixar fans, but it's this beautiful film by this somewhat small Irish animation studio, and it's amazing. It's really, I think I cried 3 times, but yeah, I think it's a really good movie.
Cool. And so I decided that this year I'm gonna give my interviewees one more question to complain about. So the final question I want to ask you is about your favorite fiction hero. So if we have, if you had to pick one fiction hero that you particularly like, who would that be?
That's probably the hardest questions you've asked me so far in the whole podcast. So because I love the Christopher Nolan Batman movies, I'm tempted to say Batman, and also love this line of, "It's not who you are inside, but what you do that makes a difference," which is not he per se that says it, but it's said by his love interest. Anyway, I also is tempted to maybe talk about like Ozymandias from Watchmen, because I find an interesting character and doing interesting things. But if I would say one, I would probably say One Punch Man. One Punch Man will be my pick. Are you familiar with One Punch Man?
Yes, but why? Can you explain why?
Yeah, so he's this it's an anime character. Actually, didn't think I would like this show because I haven't watched a lot of anime before. But it's this anime character, and he wins all of his fights with one punch. And so he's mostly just bored and depressed, and just very funny character in some ways because of that. And then I guess for me, what really makes him my favorite character is that when people try to ask him, like, how did you get so good? Like, how did you become, One Punch Man? He pretty much got his power from very mundane things, like doing good habits on a daily basis for 5 years, like doing some squats, push-ups, and jogging every day. That's how he got that good. And so it's like daily habits pretty much got him that power. And yeah, it's a funny show in many ways as well, because it's just he's not official superhero initially because you have to be registered with Superhero Association to become a superhero, and then even when he does that, he becomes kind of a low-level rank, because even though he gets 50 out of 50 in a physical exam, he almost fails the written exam. And so, yeah, it's great. And he has very low ego as well, and that's something I really admire in a good superhero, low ego.
Oh, cool. So great habits, not a huge ego, being down to earth, I guess. Yeah. Really cool. Well, Samuel, thank you so much.
And we have the same haircut, so.
Okay. Samuel, thank you so much for finding the time today. I know we went significantly over time, but I think it's worth it. Thank you so much for finding the time and talking to me today. And well, good luck with everything that you are doing. And I'm definitely I'm going to anticipate what it is that you're going to do next and hope to see more things from you. So thank you so much again for doing this.